Once again, welcome, and we're so glad that you decided to join us. My name is Dan Kimball. I am the Chief Operating Officer of the 10 Talents Foundation. I'm actually a fundraising consultant. I've been in the fundraising space for quite some time, number of years, worked for a variety of nonprofits here in the Central Valley of California, and primarily in fundraising at a variety of different roles, major gifts and grants, contracts, and a variety of other things. Been doing that for quite some time, over 20 years, in fact. And then I had the opportunity to work for a software company in the area, a fund accounting and donor management software. Did that for a few years. And then now I serve as a consultant, working alongside our executive officer, our CEO, Brent Riffle, who started 10 Talents, and have the opportunity to serve with him. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that. So that's a little bit about who I am. And again, once again, those of you who are just joining us, welcome. So this webinar is being brought to you by the 10 Talents Foundation. We're not trying to do a kind of an advertisement or anything, but just let you know a little bit about who we are. 10 Talents. We are a local community foundation here in the Fresno area, and we basically exist to help create a movement of generosity. We are trying to help people become more generous and help them with the tools that they need to take their one talent and multiply it into 10 talents. That is a biblical concept. It comes from the Bible, out of Matthew, about hiding your talents versus sharing and growing your talents. And that's really what we're all about. And how we go about doing that is we are trying to mobilize a movement of generosity here in our valley. We're trying to encourage people to become more generous, and also to think about ways at which they can do that while saving on their taxes and actually leveraging their talents or their money or their dollars to go greater, to go further, not just a little bit. And we do this in three ways. The main purpose of today's webinar is our donor advice funds, but we also have a ministry partner program. That's where we partner with local nonprofits and ministries, and they come together and we provide them tools and education on how asset-based giving works. And then, of course, we also do community education. And this is a real important part of our foundation's work. Community education is how we encourage people to think more about giving their assets to charity. What a lot of people don't realize is that 90% of what people own is in assets, and yet only 10% of what people give is in cash. And so what we're trying to do at 10 Talents is trying to help people think about what are different ways in which you can leverage your giving through assets. Assets can be everything from cash to property to stocks, crops, all sorts of different types of things can be an asset. And so that's a little bit about just a quick overview about the 10 Talents Foundation. But we're really pleased and honored today to talk about donor advised funds. And so this is a concept that might be new to some of you. So others of you, it might be you're aware of it. And so just to kind of get a sense of who's out there, Ashley's going to help us by launching a little poll question. And we're going to get kind of a sense of what you know about our donor advised funds out there. So if you just go ahead and fill in the poll here and answer the question: how familiar are you with a donor advised fund, or how familiar with how a donor advised fund works? However, so do you know nothing about a donor advised fund besides what they're called? You know the basics, but you want to learn more. Maybe you're someone that has a donor advised fund, but you're curious about more ways you could take advantage of its benefits. Or last, you consider yourself a donor advised fund expert. And in just a minute, I think Ashley's going to share the results of our poll. All right. Okay, so we have a lot of people. It looks like the overarching leader here is number 2, which is I know the basics, but I want to learn more. Well, this is great. So super glad that, and thank you, by the way, for participating in that poll. We appreciate that a lot. So good to know. So let's get moving a little bit. So at its core, at its basics, we're going to tell you a little bit about what is a donor advised fund. You'll see at the bottom, it's also known as a DAF or a DAF. So if I refer to it as a DAF throughout the webinar, know that we're talking about a donor advised fund. But probably the most, the simplest way is it's a charitable investment account with tax benefits. So it really is a way for people to leverage money through giving one time, receiving tax benefits, and then being able to give their money to various and multiple entities throughout whenever they want. There's no timeline on it. Well, that's one of the great things about it. They are very widely used, and they're growing in popularity. Over $85 billion has been was given away through donor advised funds in the United States in 2022. And that's a lot of money. That's a lot of charities benefiting. And there's still a lot of people that even don't know what a donor advised fund is. They've been around for a super long time, since actually the early 1930s is when the first donor advised fund was started. But again, over the years, as charity has grown and giving has grown and tax laws have grown and different ways to give, donor advised funds are becoming more and more popular. Probably the two places you'll see people running a donor advised fund are going to be a community foundation, which is like 10 Talents, or most communities have a community foundation in the community. And then many of your financial institutions like Fidelity and those types of financial institutions, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, they also provide a means for people to start donor advised funds. So, but in its very, very core, think about it as a charitable investment account where you give a sum of money, and then that money then sits and grows. And then you have the ability to give out of that fund to charities. And just as a reminder, you can only give to another 501c3 through your donor advised fund. You can't give to like some pet project that's not a nonprofit. So who's a donor advised fund for? Individuals. Of course, that's probably a real popular means. Families can also start a donor advised fund. So many people will start a donor advised fund as a family. The difference being is you might have multiple people that are associated with that fund and can make decisions for that fund. So many times in the application process to start a donor advised fund, you can designate that. And then lastly, businesses. A lot of businesses have the ability to create and set up a donor advised fund, and we'll talk more about that as we go. But it's a great way for businesses to also leverage tax benefits and also kind of streamline their giving to the community in which they exist and serve. So those are a little bit about that. So let's talk about how you use that donor advised fund, the uses of that fund. It's really kind of the basics of it is you start that fund. You add funds to your donor advised fund. I want to just mention that every organization that hosts donor advised funds or DAFs are a little different. Some have minimum requirements. Others you can open a donor advised fund for as little as $500. Obviously, the more you give, the more tax benefits there are. But basically, once you start that fund, you add funds to your donor advised fund. And then you receive the tax benefit the year that you give. So if you give money to your donor advised fund in 2024, you'll get a tax benefit for the 2024 tax year. But then you can give that money away whenever you want. It sits, it can grow. Most foundations will invest that money in very safe, strategic growing strategies. You will then tell the foundation which nonprofit you'd like to receive the funds. And then the foundation will then send those funds to the nonprofit on your behalf, in the name of your fund, or anonymously if that's something that you choose. So at its core, once you kind of get that away, what a lot of times people will ask is, well, why don't I just give directly to the nonprofit? What's the benefit? And that's what we want to do, is spend a little bit of time telling you about that. So what are some of the donor advised fund benefits? Of course, the first and the most obvious is the tax advantages. There's huge tax advantages when you can give a sum of money through that donor advised fund. You can see on the slide, federal income tax of up to 60% and up to 30% adjusted income for appreciated securities donated. So this is where it kind of gets, besides just cash, there's a lot of different ways. in which you can leverage a donor advised fund for those tax advantages. For example, you can give through non-cash assets, which we talked about. So agricultural crops would be one. The 10 Talents Foundation, of course, is located in the Central Valley of California, where we do have a lot of ag presence. And because of that, there's people that will want to leverage their ag crops through a donor advised fund. It's a way for them to lower their capital gains. Of course, appreciated real estate, appreciated stocks, bonds, securities. These are all different types of assets that people have that if they move them incorrectly, they can face a lot of taxes. So by using a foundation, you can receive a lot of tax benefits, and the win-win is you get that tax benefit and you become more generous by giving to the charities that you care about. So again, thinking about this as a nonprofit leader, if you're someone that runs a nonprofit or you're a part of a development team, you want to be thinking about this as you're talking to your donors out there, and they're maybe saying, well, I want to give, but I'm not really sure. This is a great tool to introduce them to. So donor advised funds are more cost effective than a private foundation, and the way they are is because of low fees and things like that. Donor advised funds also allow you to give anonymously with no minimum fund distribution. So you do have the ability. For some people, they don't want to be on the radar of every nonprofit. Sorry, nonprofit leaders. But some people do want to kind of be a little bit more under the radar. So what they can do is you can set up that donor advised fund and you can give gifts anonymously, and you don't have to necessarily give out any money at any particular time. So there's no timetable. You can give out a little bit, you can give it a lot, you can wait, you can build that fund. And so that's another really key advantage of that. Donor advised funds allow you to plan ahead and distribute later. So this would be great for someone that's maybe thinking down the road. Maybe it's before you retire, you can start kind of putting money aside, putting money into that fund, or start thinking about your family and that situation. You don't have to give, and you can give now and distribute later. So it's a great way to start building so that maybe down the road you want to become more generous. And much like a savings account, maybe you're saving for something, you can start putting money in that donor advised fund with the idea that down the road you'll become a little bit more generous later. And of course, simply it simplifies your giving. The donor advised fund, this is something that we talk to with people. A lot of our donor advised fund holders really appreciate this, that basically you're giving one time a year so that at the end of the year, you get one tax letter. Most people on average give between 5 and 8, some 8 to 10 different charities a year, which then at the end of the year, you have to kind of find all those tax receipts. You got to get those put together. You got to take those to your CPA if you use one. You got to make sure all the nonprofits have sent you one. I know people that often have to call nonprofits and say, I never got my tax receipt. So by giving through a donor advised fund, you're going to simplify your giving because you're only going to get one tax receipt for the year for that gift you made into your fund. And then when you give out to those different charities, you don't need to have a tax receipt letter. So that's one of the most attractive and I think popular reasons people like using those funds, is it really does simplify your giving. And again, once again, I just want to mention, if you do have questions throughout this webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A chat box, and at the end, we're going to go through those. So another great benefit of our donor advised funds is that you can involve your family in your giving. We're seeing more and more people who want to be generous, but they want their kids to be generous, or that next generation. And maybe that next generation doesn't necessarily have the same passion for some of the nonprofits that their parents do, or vice versa. So by doing this, it then gives that next generation or more people in your family the ability to have those conversations about generosity, and then they then have the ability to also give to the charities, nonprofits, and ministries that are close to their heart. Sometimes the next generation comes through and they say, well, my parents were real passionate about this, but we're more excited about a different direction. So and it really does bring families together. So it's a really great way to think about family giving as a family unit. Donor advised funds also, you can leverage gifts by combining gifts with other fund holders. So often what we'll see is 2 or 3 people will get together and say, what if we put our funds together and we give a larger gift to a nonprofit or a ministry that we really care about or believe in. So again, the word leverage, we use leverage a lot. So combining gifts with other fund holders is a great way to utilize your donor advised fund, and it's all allow you to do that. You can, of course, we talked about this a little bit at the front end, but one of the benefits of that donor advised fund is that once you give money into that fund, that money is going to automatically grow, and through interest. All donor advised funds are typically invested at some level. Each charity, or I'm sorry, each community foundation has a different investment policy, but in general, that's gonna grow. So you can put your money in and not give for a while, and while it sits, it's gonna grow a little bit. So that's another great advantage of that as well. So so if you're a nonprofit out there, one of the things we want to kind of talk to you about is, so for a nonprofit, what are the benefits of donor advised funds for the nonprofits out there? Well, I think you're going to appreciate this, nonprofit people. Just alone, I mean, this is just 10 Talents, and we're new. We've only been around for about 5 years. And just in that short amount of time, we've given just a little bit over $2.6 million out to our community through donor advised funds. These are people who have set up donor advised funds through our foundation and who have contacted us and said, I'd like monies to go to these various places. So if you're on listening as a nonprofit leader, this is also, again, talked about this a little bit, but this is a great way to talk to your donors about, because one of the ideas that we like to talk about 10 Talents is that many times nonprofits just think about their donors as their donors. And we really like to think about donors as everyone's donors. The more generous people are, the more people benefit. And so if you can introduce a donor advice fund idea to donors, and they get excited about that, I think it's going to also benefit you as a nonprofit leader. So that's another great advantage and tool to use. So with that, to kind of help bring it kind of home and make this a little bit more real, we've actually invited one of our donor advised fund holders at 10 Talents, and today we're going to spend a little time with Dr. Christopher Wong. And Christopher, welcome. Make sure your audio is working and all of that.
Hello.
Good. We're so glad you made the time. Dr. Wong is a dentist and has a very busy schedule, but he told everybody no teeth cleaning for 1 hour because
Exactly.
I'm not going to check anybody for an hour. But so Dr. Wong, maybe just share with us a little bit about you started a donor advised fund with 10 Talents Foundation. Maybe tell us a little bit about why you started that fund.
My background is that I've been in Fresno. I grew up in Fresno and been involved in ministries. In fact, I was 25 years, I was on a board member with Fresno Madera Youth for Christ. And I saw the need for resources, certainly as each nonprofit has their donor base, but I saw the need for, help with foundations. And I like the concept with 10 Talents of being of the Central Valley, and that it's a great networking. And through that, in meeting the CEO, Brent Riffle, I learned about 10 Talents and the opportunity to give and also learn more about the different nonprofits, ministries that are around. So this, having a donor advised fund gives me a vehicle that helps me in my busy life, as many people are, with the bookkeeping and giving and how to think in terms of giving, and also learning about other ways of giving. I mean, there's other opportunities beyond the donor advised fund within 10 talents, but
Mhm.
the donor advised fund gives me an opportunity to learn how to give
Mm.
and helps me organize my giving instead of being
Yeah.
scattered.
Yeah. What how have you found your donor advice fund to help you think about generosity as a whole? Have you thought about it differently?
I think of it differently. I think of it more. I think of more strategically instead of just giving. And when people, there's so many people giving, and I mean asking for, um, legitimate charitable organizations. But it helps me be more strategic in the areas that I'm giving the amounts and thinking future wise. How do I want to give beyond as been as Dan has already talked about, whether it's different assets and all that. So it's a kind of the I'm still relatively new, but learning about how to give beyond the usual.
Yeah. In fact, many times foundations will help you kind of vet organizations and make sure that, um, they're they're legit, or in some cases, we have people that um, they want to give to a certain need, like say a homeless or, foster youth, but there's 10 organizations in their community. So
Right.
have you been able to access help in that area yet with your donor advised fund?
Um, I'm aware of it.
Yeah,
I haven't done that or asked that question, but there's a
yeah,
lot of things that I've been asked.
yeah.
I've asked that have helped me.
Good, good. Well, thank you. Well, is there anything else about your fund that you would like to add? And
It's something that's it's a vehicle, and
right,
it's growing. It's something that I want to keep growing in terms of the amount and where, and it gives me the flexibility, and I can
right,
see it laid out what it is
good.
currently.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Good. Well, Dr. Wong, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to just kind of give a little personal testimony. We know we appreciate it, and it's always it's an honor to have you, and I'm really pleased that you've decided to utilize your donor advice fund through 10 Talents. So thanks for being here.
absolutely. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Dr. Wong. So next question, some of you might ask again. So you kind of heard the benefits of those donor advised fund, and again, we will do Q&A at the very end. Um, so how do you start a donor advised fund? It's super simple. Again, each organization is a little different, but once you find who hosts those donor advised funds, again, different foundations have various minimum requirements. Some are real small, some are as a little larger, like 25,000. Again, we want to kind of few things people want to understand is once you put that money in, you can't take it out. So even though we like to use that term, it's kind of like a charitable checking account. It's not like that, and that you don't get to decide that you're done and you take it out. All donor advised funds, once you put that money in, it does belong to the foundation. So many times there's language in the agreement that you make. You'll fill out an application. Most foundations can usually have it up and going within a day, if not a little bit more. There's usually some kind of agreement that says, hey, just so you understand, when you're, even if you're done, you no longer, we, in a sense, own the assets to this fund. And a nice thing is you can designate beneficiaries. So we have a lot of people that will say, okay, if something happens to me or when I die, I'd like for so-and-so to take over my fund. So that's another thing. So would encourage you to, if you are either, thinking about it or want to have more questions about that side, you can always reach out to your CPA or advisor with questions about that. But they are very easy at 10 Talents. We do have both an online and a physical application, and our turnaround is pretty short. So that's how you go about doing it there. And then just kind of before we dive into the Q&A, we did get a little bit of ahead of schedule. I think we slated this to 12:15, but hopefully we'll have some questions. And if I blew over anything a little too fast, I'm happy to go back and and highlight that. But a few highlights that I just want to kind of recap as we before we get into the Q&A is again the some of the benefits that we've seen so far. One is that we have a lot of people that just don't always know how to think about their giving. And so by setting up that donor advised fund, I think it allows people to be more strategic. And I think that their dollars make more impact down the road. So if you give quick, to quick campaigns and quick checks, that's helpful. And I know that nonprofits appreciate it. I think by encouraging people to use a donor advised fund, it makes them kind of pause and think and be more strategic. And ultimately, I think what it does is it gets larger gifts to more people by doing that. So I would just kind of encourage you as you're having conversations, again, either with people or if you yourself are in conversations about starting that donor advised fund, that would be a really great way to leverage it. Some people just kind of get overwhelmed. They flat out overwhelmed. There's so much need in our communities, and they just think, gosh, if I give here or there, and I think a donor advised fund can really help think that stuff through. And then it matches your values. 10 Talents Foundation, we do have a biblically based, we are a faith-based foundation. Doesn't mean that the nonprofits that receive money will have to be faith-based, but we do like to align faith values with giving. So it's good conversation that we can have. So with that, Ashley, should I go ahead and just do the Q&A or are you going to lead that?
Hey Dan, great job. That was a great presentation.
Oh, thank you.
We do have a couple questions and I'd be happy to read them. I see
Great.
one of our support team members is also answering them in the chat. But the first
Great.
question is from Rob and he asks, are the tax advantages with a DAF better than giving directly to a nonprofit entity? And I'm wondering, Dan, if you could also um, talk a little bit of an example when giving an asset, using a house as an example, and just maybe help
Sure.
us walk us through that in a little more detail.
Yeah, great question. And so that is a really good question. And I would say that the tax advantages are most likely going to be based off the size. So obviously the larger the gift, the more tax advantages they're going to be. So and then there are some additional tax benefits by giving through that donor advised fund. So yes, in general there are. Keeping in mind that often though people aren't necessarily going to, and again, if you're a nonprofit leader, this isn't maybe the news you want to hear, but people might want to give a large sum of money, but they want to spread it out. So if they can spread it out and put that money in that donor advised fund, they're going to get that tax benefit and then give out to those different charities. I hope that kind of makes sense. So in terms of assets, though, this is something where a lot of people are really using and leveraging those donor advised funds. So the sale of a house, sale of a stock, crops, things like that. As many may know, if you don't know that there's a lot of capital gain risk in that, and so if you can donate the house to a foundation through a donor advised fund, then what happens when you sell that house, you will know that what you would normally pay in capital gains would then be saved through taxes. And then you now have that money instead of giving to the government, whatever that difference is, you now have that to distribute to charity. So that would be a house example. Our crop giving program, I think, is really an opportunity that a lot of nonprofits have in terms of encouraging people that that are in the ag industry, where somebody can literally donate a portion of their crop through to the foundation. The foundation then holds that portion of crop on paper, and then when they go to sell that crop, the money of that donated crop then goes to that person's DAF, and then what the ag person, the farmer, gets out of that is they're able to write off all the expenses as well as save on potential capital gains. So that would be a second example of that.
That's great. So what I'm hearing, Dan, is that that can be extremely beneficial for both the donor and the nonprofit. Maybe the
Yeah.
nonprofit doesn't have the capacity to process large or complicated, clunky
Right. Yeah.
asset-based gifts like a house. And so if your donor has a donor advised fund, they can both receive a huge tax benefit by donating the asset directly to the foundation and not necessarily having to pay capital gains taxes. And then they can also give more because they have that extra money that didn't go to taxes that they could give to your organization. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, that's great. And you actually brought up a good point, which I failed to mention, which is for a lot of nonprofits, many nonprofits they just don't have the staff or the capacity to accept those kind of gifts. And so you can certainly do the work and set all that stuff up. But many times it's going to mean you need to create a board gift acceptance policy. There's a lot of things that have to happen. You need legal help, you need real estate help if it's a piece of property. But by having the foundation do it, you can then save a lot more time so you can focus on your work, and then the foundation can kind of handle that for you, knowing that ultimately you being the nonprofit leader would receive that. So it is a really great use of a foundation, is to get some of the weight off of your shoulders of a complicated gift, because there's some real simple gifts, but there's also some real complicated types of giving that a foundation can be really helpful for, and a donor advised fund on top of that.
I see Rob asked a second question. If he asks, can a nonprofit open its own donor advised fund and donate back to itself? And our team member, I think this might be Brent in here responding,
Yeah.
mentioned ministry funds. Would you mind talking about that briefly, Dan?
Yeah, so there really isn't a lot of benefit to donating to yourself, and I'm hoping that Brent's going to tackle that. But a ministry fund would be a way. We have created ministry funds. So one example for a ministry fund, and I think most of our people that signed up for this webinar already established 501c3s. But let's say that you're a new charity and you're still kind of waiting for all the paperwork to happen, or you're still waiting for your official 501c3 status. You can create a ministry fund through, say, 10 Talents, and people can give directly to 10 Talents. We set it aside and then redistribute it to your nonprofit. So that would be one use of a ministry fund. Or again, if your nonprofit wants to create a ministry fund for Rob, say in Rob's case, um, then when somebody does say turn an asset into cash or have a complex gift, they can do it through the foundation, and all of that money will go right into that ministry fund directly for that nonprofit. So that would probably be the best case scenario.
That's great. Thank you, Dan.
Any other questions? So again, the just to kind of re-emphasize for our nonprofit leaders that are on the webinar, I want to say thank you, and also just want to remind you this is a great conversation to have with some of your I'll call them more savvy or sophisticated donors, or donors who you know are who are giving at larger levels to various organizations. It's something that I think if they know about that, and you want to help them give bigger and save on taxes, I think it'll be a great benefit to you. For individuals, again, I can't encourage it enough to say it's a great way to leverage your giving and do more planning in your giving. We've talked with somebody at 10 Talents recently who is has a family business, and is kind of in the early stages of starting to think about retirement. And many people forget that for people that retire, that changes their income. They go on a fixed income. And so that person's starting to, I'll use the word front load their donor advised fund now. They're starting to put money in now. So when they retire, they already have money in there that they can start giving to the charities and things that they love.
Mm. Dan, if I were a ministry leader, I feel like I'd be too focused on all the day-to-day operations at thinking about giving 10 years from now or 15 years from now is not something that is maybe part of my strategy.
Yeah.
But for a ministry, it sounds like if you can help your donors think about giving years from now, that allows them to be generous in the long term and allows your organization to be more sustainable. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Ashley. And I think that it really is kind of what a lot of what we're trying to do at 10 Talents is trying to think bigger, not just about one or two nonprofits, but as nonprofit leaders thinking about, for donors, many of them are giving to multiple organizations, and they want as many benefits of that as they can, including not getting overwhelmed with request after request. So it can kind of give them a little bit more control. But absolutely. So I did put up the slide. If you are new to 10 Talents or have never heard of us before, please feel free to look us up through our website. Of course, we have some social media as well. You can give us a call. You can, if you'd like to talk with us further, please utilize our contact information. Were there any other questions? I don't want to rush, but did we get through all of those?
We do have another question from
Okay,
Sarah.
great.
If a donation is given through a donor advised fund,
Uh-huh.
are nonprofits able to stay connected with that donor?
Yeah. Yeah. So what we do, that's an excellent question. And so what the donors have the option to let the nonprofit know if if they want it anonymous or not. And then often many times donors will say, would you like the nonprofit to send you a note of thanks? And many of them will say yes. So in your letter, you'll receive a letter with a check that says a donation's been made to your charity or nonprofit by so-and-so donor. And it will remind them you don't need to send them a tax letter, but if you'd like to send them a note of thanks. So it's absolutely appropriate and fine if the donor chooses to not be anonymous to cultivate that relationship, whether that's inviting them to something or taking them out for coffee. 100%. We have a lot of donors that do that. We do have the cases where from time to time we'll have a donor advised fund holder who, for whatever reason, they said, on this one, I'd like to just be anonymous. Sometimes they're giving on behalf of somebody else, or whatever. So it's really up to the donor. Great question, though.
Dan, I have a question about how easy it is as a donor if I have a donor advised fund. If I were working with a foundation like 10 Talents,
Mhm.
what does the process look like to say, okay, hey, now I'm ready to give to a nonprofit? Do I do that online? Do I
Oh
call?
yeah. We didn't get into that too much, but that's a great. So with 10 Talents, I'm going to speak for 10 Talents. Um, the way we work it is once you set up your application and all of that's good to go and put money into your fund. We actually give our donors the option to have a donor portal. We use some software, and they get a login and password to their donor portal. And at that time, they literally can log into that portal, make a request, and then the foundation will receive that request, approve it, and then process that check. We also go through a whole vetting process. We press that request against the GuideStar database to make sure that organization you're wanting to give to is actually still up and running, that their 990 has been filed. So we screen for that. And then send that check out. So it's a really, and then at any time, donors can log into their portal. They can check the balance of their donor advised fund, and see their past giving, get copies of letters that were sent, all of that. So it's a really great tool. Again, most foundations have something like that. I can't speak for all of them, but I know at 10 Talents, that's how we definitely have that portal, and we have that up very, very quickly. We have a few donors that don't like to use technology, so they'll just send us an email or phone a phone call and say, I'm ready to give some money. And we do it that way too. Great question, Ashley.
Great answer, Dan.
All right.
It looks like
No more questions.
no more questions, but you did
Okay.
have about, a few more seconds before we close this up. So
Yeah. So I'm going to close just by again saying thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit more about donor advised funds, a little bit more about 10 Talents. We do hope that you'll, follow us along on our social media and our website. But I would really encourage you to, if this has kind of triggered any thinking to learn more about donor advised funds, look into them, and again, really, we're always amazed at some of the people that we talk to as a foundation who are donors, who are givers in the community that have never heard of a donor advised fund and are quickly amazed at the use of one and how easy it is to start one and use one, and then the tax benefits that go along with it. So with that, I think we could go ahead and close it out.
thanks, Dan. Thank you
Okay.
all.
Thank you everybody for participating and keep an eye out for more educational webinars in the future. And we hope you learned something today.